This is Agronomy Moment. I'm Wendell Cohen. Good day, everybody. Welcome to Agronomy Moment. Joining me today here is Celena Kipping, our agronomist here for Southwest Missouri. And this is part of our series of projects that we've been working on this winter regarding questions that you, the listener, have submitted. And today's topic is called bugs. Controlled or not is our question. A little bit of the outline of the meeting and how it rolls forward is what is the definition of a bug? Why? The cost of ignoring a problem. We'll dive into a little bit of Beck's PFR proven dollar and cost situations there. And then go to what? Control versus suppression. Those that cause yield loss directly versus others. And finally, how? Scouting is more than just let's a bug, let's shoot. Quick disclaimer before we dive in. All information here is simply information that is for the purpose of you finding what's an answer for your farm. I think it's has some thoughtful and in-depth, insightful pieces here for you to consider, but none of this is a recommendation for your farm. We can definitely do that on a one-on-one basis. So with that, we're going to move to our first slide, bugs. Who are the bugs? So help me understand a little bit, Celena. Bugs is kind of a general term, right?
Yep.
I mean, if an insect is 6 legs, a spider has 4 legs.
Yeah. Yeah.
We kind of call them all bugs sometimes.
Yep. It's just kind of a realm that we kind of put everything in, and
Yes.
we label everything as a bug, though there
Yeah.
are differences, and that's one of the values that we're going to try to bring today is know a few of those differences and the damage that could potentially have. We're going to focus a little bit more today on a soybean crop, as far as the insects that are going to
Sure.
really, you know,
Yes.
affect our yields, or could potentially affect our yields. So that's why on this slide we kind of Wendell put in there the different classifications and kind of the different bugs or insects, that we're going to be dealing with or seeing, most often, or
Yes.
trying to control or find ways to um, help, our thresholds, or once we get to those thresholds, what do we do?
Yes. And because, it doesn't matter so much who they are. It's
Mhm.
what is the true pest? How does
Yep.
it relate to your yield? And it doesn't matter that we call corn earworm a worm, and it's
Mhm.
really a caterpillar that
Right.
becomes an insect, right?
Right.
And things
Right.
like that. But so scientifically and officially, things aside,
Hmm.
the creepy crawly things that we'll focus on today is what does it relate to the cost of your crop, and what can we do about it? So
Yeah,
here, I'll
so
turn it over to
to
you.
to to kick it off here, I'm gonna talk a little bit about a PFR proven, a couple insecticides, and one thing I really want to hit on is just the importance of R3 and pod fill and protecting that soybean crop if our thresholds are to that level. And these are just a couple of the proven insecticides. There's oodles and gobs of other insecticides with very similar active ingredients that will do a good job, other than Mustang Max and Fast Act. Again, this is just multi-year data looking at these applied at a R3 stage. And typically, in an R3 stage, we can look at a fungicide application also. So,
Sure.
and an insecticide and a fungicide at R3 could potentially be really beneficial for our soybean crop. Um, we think about bifenthrins and how good that those can be on some of our hard-shelled insects. And we've got Tundra and Brigade, and just to name a couple
Yep.
of the other, commonly used insecticides. And what was that one you were saying earlier? Baythroid is another,
Yes.
Baythroid XL,
Leverage.
leverage. some of the others that
Yeah, I mean, this thing's advancing on me.
that that will do a good job for us
Yep.
also. So again, we're going to dive a little bit into our direct yield loss bugs and our defoliators, which will lead us on to our I think our next slide there. So um, here's the slide that it keeps wanting us to go to. So we think of our direct yield loss insects and our defoliating insects and the damage that that could have on our soybean crops. So our direct yield loss are going to be our stink bugs, corn earworms, or our soybean podworm. Both of those are the same thing. We just sometimes, depending on what crop we're talking about or what circumstance, can affect what terminology we use there. And then the bean leaf beetle in the upper right hand corner there to point out some of the damage. In the very, very right hand corner, that's going to be typical bean leaf beetle soybean pod damage. The middle one is going to be our stink bug damage with a developing seed. And then the left picture is kind of a first initial damage caused by a stink bug on that soybean pod. So it can start out looking like that, but when we open up the pod, it can get as severe as that middle picture and the bottom pod on that
And it
picture.
doesn't look like hardly anything to hardly take note of in the first left one.
Yep. And that kind of with our direct yield loss insects, and I like to, we think about the things that we can see. And
Yes.
and the things that we can see most of the time are our defoliators. So
Like the picture we show there of the
yeah,
leaves.
yeah. And so like our armyworms or loopers or grasshoppers, things like that are defoliators that like Wendell said, that picture in the lower right hand corner is going to show our percent defoliation across leaves, and that's going to help us make a decision on is it to the threshold that it needs to be in order to warrant a insecticide application. Um, and back to the it's that's what we can see, and so most of the time we think it's worse than potentially it actually could be, and we might not be thinking about our direct yield loss
Sure.
insects quite as often.
Yes. So we need to be paying attention to the little signals of those direct yield losses. It relates to our yield.
So to
Help me
hit,
understand this slide here with what we got going on here.
yep. So the first picture on the left there is going to be a stink bug. Really common, and the threshold for a stink bug is going to be relatively lower compared to some of the other insects that we think about because they can cause damage very quickly. And to the seed number, the pod, seeds in the pods, and the treatment for that is one stink bug per one row of one
Yeah.
row or 1 foot, sorry.
Yeah.
And so that's gonna be our threshold we look for on the stink bugs, and a lot of the time it's gonna be getting out into that field, taking
Yes.
a look underneath the canopy
Yes.
of the soybeans because they're gonna be in that pod area, the stem area of the
Yes.
crop. So
And I wanted to pause you for just a little bit because I'm going to show a picture, insert a picture here
okay.
of that. And what does this other bug that looks very similar? I didn't was even aware of that.
So
Just tell
yeah,
me just a little bit about that. And so I'm going to cut.
okay.
So I'm going to bring that picture in later. I'll just probably just bring it in under
Okay.
this slide picture in picture.
Okay.
And so you can just talk about it as
Okay.
if it was up there and
Okay.
roll on. So
Okay. So yeah, the stink bug actually has a predatory, and most insects that we talk about, bugs we talk about, do have a predatory insect that will feed on or parasite the bug itself. So one bug we think about that looks very similar to a stink bug is a soldier bug, and it's going to have like if we look at the stink bug on its kind of shoulders of like in
yes,
relative to like a person, like
yes,
on its shoulders here, you can see kind of more of an obtuse angle
yes,
as far as the points.
yes.
On the soldier bug, it's going to be more of an acute angle and kind of
Yeah.
more of a
You can see
spiny.
it and it's spiky here
Yeah,
there.
it's kind of spiky. So that's kind of the difference there. But it'd be really hard to tell out in the field, potentially if you didn't have them side by side.
And
what was
the
what.
soldier bug eats the stink bug,
Yes, it's a predatory.
even though it looks like the other guy. They know
Yep.
each other apart, and then he goes after him, right?
Right, right.
So, this is all new to me to think about that.
Hmm.
If you, but let's say I'm walking out there and I've got stink bugs,
Hmm.
and I've got this, and I find one soldier bug.
Hmm.
Do I not spray?
Well, I think it goes back to how many stink bugs are we seeing
Sure.
per
Yes.
our 1 foot.
Yes.
If we're seeing it to a threshold where it needs to be a
Yep.
warranted treatment, it's probably going to be to that point we should really
Spray.
consider spraying,
Yep.
because I would like to think that it
Yes.
would really solve all of our
Right.
problems, but just
Yep.
a good note is that most insects will have a predatory insect to some extent or bug, and that will help with the populations of
Gotcha.
these. So,
Anyway,
um,
go on to the continue on with our next one.
yep, so moving right along, the middle picture there is going to be a podworm, or commonly really known as a corn earworm. And, we commonly would probably look at that and think, nope, that's corn earworm. Looks,
Yes.
so,
Yes.
and it is.
It is.
So same, colors and body types and legs and everything that a corn earworm has. So um, treatment would be justified when 20% or more defoliation occurs during pod fill, or one or more larvae are present per linear foot of row. So the podworm is a little bit different, and we'll kind of hit on this a little bit more as far as the
Yep.
worms and the caterpillars and things are
Sure.
concerned with an insecticide. But really, really important to note that also, as well as the stink bug, can cause major damage in those
And
higher.
they scar the edge of the pod, or do they eat? They'll eat the pods themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Yes.
yep, or kind of chew into
Yes.
that pod. Yep.
Tell me a little bit more about the beetles now. How do we tell those apart? Or
Yep, so the bean leaf beetle is a far picture on the right. One kind of telltale sign that you're looking at a bean leaf beetle is that kind of triangle on the back of its neck area, and you're gonna see different colors of beetles. There's bean leaf beetles. There's red and greens, and in this case, it kind of looks like we got a light green one there, but
yeah.
that triangle there on its back is going to be a help distinguish that it's a bean leaf beetle.
Okay.
And 10 or more bean leaf beetles per foot of row with 20% defoliation is going to warrant probably a threshold for a spray.
Okay.
And with these, we're talking about like fast acts, Baythroids, brigades, Mustang Max. A lot of those are going to do a good job on controlling these insects. Sorry, that was a part that I
Yes.
kind of left out, but
Let's talk about the defoliators a little bit, the differences here, and
yep. So these are the ones we want to blame, right?
okay.
So we see our soybean leaves getting ate up and things like that, and think, oh my goodness, and
Mhm.
the if you want to reference back to that what slide? But I think it's actually the slide just before the direct yield loss bugs or insects.
Yeah.
That shows the defoliation as far as the yeah, there we go.
Yep.
That is going to help us distinguish where we're at with
Sure.
to warrant a treatment. So just to reference back to that, that's
It's
there.
like 20, like when one looks out there and you see 20%, it actually looks like 40% to me.
Yep.
So it always seems to look a little worse.
It does. Yep. And so to hit on it, first one there on the left is an armyworm. This distinguishing characteristic of the armyworm, again, kind of like the bean leaf beetle, that it's going to have what you could call a Y
Yes.
on the back of its head there, and that's going to be a telltale sign, characteristic of an armyworm.
Oh, yeah, over like some other similar caterpillar.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't have cutworm that time of year, but would that be a similar looking?
Yes, it could
Yes.
look similar, yep.
Yes.
But that's kind of the distinguishing of the armyworm itself.
What makes the armyworm though a problem? Is it because it's so many, they can be so many and they're aggressive, or what?
Yep. So they can be really aggressive, and the potential of them to overwinter also.
Okay.
And I think yeah, I think that's right. And you want to treat when they get to like a 30%
Yes.
foliage loss on the soybean crop, and when the larvae are about half an inch or longer.
Okay.
Because you
Sure.
know
Then they have quite a bit of life left. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
What
And
about the loopers?
then the loopers, there's those are interesting. So we can kind of get the loopers and the clover worms. They're kind of look
Hmm.
pretty similar,
Sure.
but that looper is going to be just a tad bit harder to control than a clover worm. So if we see thresholds out there for loopers, and it's probably not going to be the only insect that we're going to have problems with. But if there was a certain situation where we're really having problems with that looper, we need to look at a specific active that is going to control that. And it's going to look a little bit different compared to
Sure.
some of the other insects we're going after. That's kind of a different scenario
So
there.
typically we're not so worried about them in themselves because
Mhm.
usually we're going after the pod feeders and all
Mhm.
that. But if you went out there and you were actually getting a defoliation problem
Yep.
with a looper,
Hmm.
just going out and saying, I'm just going to go spray
Just yeah.
leverage 360, we're
Yeah.
not going to control them as much.
Right. Right. Our um, let's see, Prevathon is going to be
Okay.
one that is going to do a going to have a better control
Okay.
on the soybean looper, and kind of thinking a little bit of a herbicide here whenever we attack with more than just one mode of action in some of these
Yes.
situations. Not to bring that to the herbicides, but we think about herbicides, we want to use
Yes.
more than one. In
Yes.
this case, it would probably be really beneficial too. So if we were targeting that looper, then we could also target some hard-shelled
Sure.
insects with that,
Sure.
and do a really good job with that looper and even the armyworm as
Sure.
well.
Sure.
So, um,
Any thoughts on grasshoppers? I think we all kind of identify those.
yeah. So grasshopper is they're typically we see them moving from the edge in a lot of our grain crops. So
Okay.
corn too, soybeans also. So they're gonna move in from the edge and then they'll migrate towards
Okay.
the middle of the field. So sometimes maybe you look at a treatment on the the
Sure.
edges of your field if it's that bad if defoliation reaches 20%, like
Yes.
we're kind of talking about with some of our other defoliators, probably would consider
Sure.
a insecticide for a grasshopper. And then also on a grasshopper, if there's other pod feeding insects present, which
Yes.
most of the time there probably will be, then we probably need to seriously think about taking action.
Sure. And I was just curious on when we're talking about defoliation, and you walk out there a lot of times in the field, and one sees cutting, and you can see that. And let's just say we're sitting here at 35%, but you've got three different bugs that you've been observing
Mhm.
out there. Um, how do you know which one is contributing to that, or are you just more going by the populations? You're not so worried about what the cut looks like because that can be a little different, but that's probably not such an important.
Right, yeah, because we're thinking that it's not going to be a
Yes.
perfect world where we just go and we have one
Right.
insect problem. So we're going to be in a lot of situations where we have multiple
Yes.
insects, and so then it comes, like you said, to the thresholds.
Yes.
What is the threshold as far as the defoliation,
Yes.
or what is the threshold as far as
Yes.
how many insects we're seeing per
Foot of
in
row.
some of our cases per 1 foot of row. And then that's kind of how we make that
Yes.
justification and
Yes.
advise on the treatment or non-treatment or however we're going to
Yep.
go about that because it'd be really hard to go out there and just nail it down to on because each plant's going to be
Exactly.
different. There might be a few loopers over here, but in a different part of your field, you might be having like an edge. You might be having more
Yes.
problems with a grasshopper,
Yes.
things like that. So just some things to take in consideration there.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about our exceptions. Slugs. Sometime we get into, especially like in cover crop situations
Hmm.
and wet springs, you can get those. They're a mollusk. They're not
Hmm.
going to die from insecticide, right?
Right.
So, I mean, they're very difficult.
Hmm.
You can spray a salt on them or a UAN nitrogen, but
Hmm.
you're probably going to smoke your beans doing it if you're going to try to control the slug. Like, I mean, generally, right? Like
Right.
this one's a hard one. I don't know if there's a lot to say.
Yeah, there's not a ton to cover here because, like you said,
Yeah,
it's kind of in those specific scenarios with the cover crop and just the heavy residue
yes,
situations where we see the slugs.
sure.
Uh,
No, but with last year in 22, we had problems with spider mites. Let's talk a
yeah.
little bit about them and just talk a little bit about how they, like, as we can see up there on the slide, they're different. They're
Hmm.
not an insect. So,
Right. Yep. So spider mites in a dry year are going to be a concern. That's kind of where they thrive in the environments that they
yeah,
thrive in, and the spider mites are going to be on the underneath side of the leaf, and they're almost microscopic, very hard to see.
yes,
So in trying to find spider mites, it's kind of important that, and with other insects too, a lot of insects that we try to not disturb the plant that we potentially would be looking at, and
yes,
kind of are careful with how we look at the underneath sides of those leaves, and they kind of create a webbing underneath
yes,
the leaf, and that can be actually easier to see than the spider mite itself, just of what kind of they leave behind there.
yes.
Yep.
And then they're controlled differently, right? There's
Yep.
certain insecticides do control
So
them, but many actually do nothing really.
right, yeah. So we want a longer lasting insecticide, longer lasting pyrethroid,
Yeah,
that that will kill the population there, that's the adults, and then will also be able to control the eggs.
yes,
Because if we don't, then we have a huge
explosion.
explosion of spider mites if we don't kind of look at taking the right active into consideration.
Sure. Nematodes, I'm not going to say much on this. That's a total different ball of wax. I mean, they're underground, they're parasites, but just another example of when we're talking bugs and
Hmm.
things that are affecting yield, nematodes are a big problem in the United States today and in our area. Um, there's other underground pests like wireworm,
Hmm.
maggots. Again, these here are not controlled foliar and surface, right?
Correct. One thing with the nematodes and the underground pests, I
Okay.
think one thing that we should kind of hit on is our seed treatment. You
Okay.
know, a
Yes.
seed treatment, an insecticide seed treatment is going to help combat some of those things,
Yes.
and really help us with some of that
Yes.
control to where we don't see or don't maybe lose
Yes.
as much of a stand because we have our seed treatment to help with that. Like for example, and the Escalade is going to be
Yes.
our Nemasect.
Yes.
That's going to help with our soybean nematode populations, our wireworms or maggots or
Yeah.
grubs like you were hitting on. So
Yeah.
in order to help with control of those, we would look into a seed treatment that would target some of those
Yes.
pests.
And then we look also at nematodes, like you can add a levo
Hmm.
as an additional because it has a
Yep,
certain suppression of
absolutely.
nematodes, it appears so. Dectus stem borer, once in a while, this can happen, right?
Hmm.
And these here are also there. It's an insect, it's a caterpillar, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard, also hard because of its habitat.
Yeah, and whenever they bore into that stem,
Yes.
they kind of create a plug that are at the bottom, and that just gonna kind of shut off
Yeah.
everything that the soybean needs, and because everything is coming, from the leaves
Yeah.
and coming from, the roots and things like that. So, that one is interesting, and
Yeah.
uh, and in certain scenarios could potentially be, really
Yeah.
bad, and with that one, we typically don't notice it until pretty much harvest or
Yes.
really late season. That's whenever we see
Plants.
the plants start to really fall
Yes.
over and cut inside of them, and you can see where
Yes.
they have either put that plug or have bored through that stem.
In corn earworm, we have a little bit of just kind of that similar thing going on where they're shielded by insecticide. Both of these bugs can be killed with insecticide. it's an effective control, but it's
Hmm.
just the location of where the bug is that causes us to not be able to effectively control them.
Yeah.
And so, kind of want to just talk about these exceptions in a general sense. Um, that you either need to use a different product or it needs
Hmm.
to go into a different place
Hmm.
or preventative and things like that. Like
Yep.
with corn earworm, new traits like Viptera
Hmm.
and Leptra,
Yep.
to name.
Above ground traits that will help target or corn
Yep,
earworms will definitely help with that.
sure.
As you said, because if they're really not outside of the ear or outside of the plant, they're going to be hard to control.
Yes.
And a
Kind of
little bit,
continue on this. I'll
yep,
let you take this.
a little bit more on the exceptions. Kind of going to focus on if what would happen in a dry year. If we look at another dry year,
Yes.
what are some things to be aware of? And like we already hit on the spider mites, but another pest that we need to be probably looking at too in a dry year could be white flies. And they're going to actually be in the aphid class, which is the picture there on the right. I just wanted to put a picture of
Yeah.
aphids up there to kind of
Yes.
show you what a aphid looks like on the underneath side of the leaf, and maybe a little bit of an extreme scenario there, but just to get an
Yes.
idea of the family that it is related to, the white fly and the spider mite are going to leave a very similar, well, excuse me, the spider mite is going to have the webbing. The whitefly and the aphid are going to leave kind of a
Okay.
sooty mold, kind of a honeydew, a sticky kind of substance behind whenever they're there and
Yes.
present and feeding. And we think about these insects, most generally speaking, are always going to be on the underneath side of leaves,
Okay.
which makes them, again, really hard to notice, really hard to see whenever we're scouting. They're small, they're tiny.
Yes.
Um, so if it comes to that insecticide application, we really want to be sure we're using our labeled rates, our full labeled rates,
Yes.
and good coverage. So we're using a good carrier to be able to help combat them being on the underneath side of the leaf or underneath side of the canopy.
Sure. And just real briefly, like make sure you've got good nozzles for the maximum coverage. You
Hmm.
said good water
Hmm.
and go ahead and get a fog going out there.
Yep. And then also back to um, the thresholds. I don't think there's actually a threshold for white flies, but if we do have an aphid presence or if we do have a spider mite presence,
Yes.
that's going to probably make our, what a white fly damage could do. It's
Yes.
gonna, kind of explode all of those problems.
Sure.
So, just kind of another thought there.
Okay. Very good. Now I want to go move to as we start to look towards the last part of our podcast. I'm interested in the how, finding our answers simply. One of the points that come to my mind was scout the field. Gonna have to get the boots on and go out and do it. Driving by on the field, on the road, looking at
Yep.
your field is different than getting out there and understanding because, like spider mites, for example, can sometimes from the distance start to look like, well, maybe it's a potassium deficiency,
Hmm.
and it might be.
Hmm.
Or
And yeah, they're gonna cause this a similar look with that yellow speckling of the
yes,
plant. It's just gonna look like it's kind of sandblasted, kind of
yes,
is
yes,
kind of a look.
yeah,
But to Wendell's point of putting the boots back on and how do we scout for these insects? A lot of times, like a sweep net could be
okay,
used,
sure,
and I'm sure everybody has kids who would just love to go out and
yes,
sweep net around. So,
yes,
and also a white drop cloth. So
okay,
whenever we're looking for like our worms, our podworms, things like
yes,
that, laying a white drop cloth in between rows and
yes,
shaking those plants and seeing what falls out from the canopy.
okay,
Also a really good tool, really easy
yes,
tool to use there. So those are just a couple of different ways that we
yes,
can look, and also taking the time to look at different parts of our fields and going into different parts of those
sure,
fields,
yep,
because like just an easy one to hit on with the grasshoppers. Maybe we only have grasshoppers at the very edge of our field next to a road ditch,
yes,
and the rest of the field is not quite as bad. So it's important too to get representative ideas from different parts of
sure,
the field.
that makes sense. And then, like we talked about, nutrient deficiencies versus, a bug
Hmm.
deficiency. Driving by on the road, it can look yellowish,
Hmm.
and it could be several things.
Hmm.
Um, The other thing is, we talked a little bit already about that, is IDing the bug, making sure we know which bug we're focusing on. Because,
Mm-hmm.
like to your point earlier, you mentioned about the loopers.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, not ever a problem. We're not, I should say never, but we're not usually focused on them.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we went out there and the defoliation was actually a problem and that was a focus, we need to know that because it's a different insecticide to
Absolutely.
do good control, right?
Absolutely.
Um, insecticide knowledge. This one here could this really actually is a Pandora's box of many, many different things. Because there's you look. I started reading through these labels and I was taking notes and I thought, sure, there's a way to simplify this. And it just seems like every product has its thing that it has really good on control,
Yep.
not so good on suppression, and the
Mm-hmm.
part that it does not control at all, another insecticide will control really well, but leave all the rest out, right?
Yep. So that's kind of back to that point of maybe looking at a couple different modes, a couple different actives to help
Sure.
us target a wider range of
Products.
pests
Yep.
of insects
Yep.
out there. So this chart here actually, I think it's from the University of Tennessee, does a pretty good job of encompassing some of the most common insecticides that we're
Yes.
probably going to hear or about or that we are actually going to use. It's going to take a rating scale there, 0 being no control and 10 being excellent. And like I said, this is in Tennessee, so a little bit, probably dealing with some different environments there, but overall gives you kind of a bigger picture look at these different insecticides and how well or
Yes.
how well I guess they don't do
Yes.
on some insects. Like our defoliators, like on the looper, you can look down there and see that, there's not a lot of insecticides that, are 5 or greater. There's a lot there that are going to fall below that.
Yes.
But the important thing is like Wendell said, is we're probably targeting more than just loopers. So we want to think about our pod feeders. We want to think about those direct yield loss pests
And that
as
would be over
well.
on this side of the chart.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to pause this video a bit if you want to study this, but because I feel like it has some really interesting things to
Yep.
reference off of.
Yep. And also these insecticides on here, you know, a lot of them probably have a very similar as another insecticide. It's just looking at those labels and looking at that active ingredient, seeing
Yes.
how much of that active ingredient is in a different insecticide, for example, because there's oodles and gobs, and it would you would scroll for days trying to
Yes.
encompass every single insecticide that different companies have. But like I said, just going, searching a hero label, seeing looking at that active ingredient and saying, okay, well, then you can search that active ingredient and find other
Yes.
insecticides that are very similar.
Yes. Yep. I thought that was a handy chart there to look at. So.
Mm-hmm.
Oops, technical difficulties. All right. We've wrapped up mostly what we were wanting to talk about today on insecticides. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to phone number and emails on the screen. Celena, before we go, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. Like Wendell said, putting the boots on and getting out there and seeing what we've got and what we're dealing with and maybe taking advantage of those fungicide applications a little bit more with an insecticide would probably be beneficial and looking into that.
Very good. We want to thank the different ones who contributed to this. There's different universities there that we've tried to reference. You have watched this and feel like you have not been included in this, feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to correct that. Special thank you also here to Celena for contributing to this presentation and also being in the podcast here today. Once again, we thank you all our listeners for watching this, and we hope you found it valuable. Please give us feedback, give us a like, review, follow us on YouTube and everywhere, wherever you get your podcasts. So with that,
we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you. Everyone, thank you for joining us today on Agronomy Moment, a Top Ag Services production. If you want alerts on what we are finding in the field, go to topagservices.com/signups to receive alerts, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is our goal to bring you the most recent and advanced information possible. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to reach out to us anytime. We also ask you that you give us a like and follow our channel wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch these videos. This ultimately helps us reach more people like you. Hey, this has been Wendell Cohen, your show host. Thank you to all who made this show possible. This show is over. See ya.